Intersection Observer API is a web API which is available in all modern browsers. Just like how your neighborhood granny observes her entire neighborhood and works as a full-time CCTV camera, if neighborhood kid, meaning you, does something funny, then she notifies your father. Just like that, we can use this Intersection Observer API in our JavaScript code to observe one or more elements on our web page. And if those elements comes into contact with a certain element, then we can execute some code accordingly. Just like if you were to break your neighbor's window, the granny will witness that and notify your father about it. Then your father will unleash his trusty leather belt and perform some instructions on you. Now let's look at a more practical example to understand this better. Let's say we have a lot of sections in a web page and we need to animate them in such a way that when these sections comes into the view, they should become visible with a fade in animation, otherwise they should be hidden. One way to implement such functionality would be to add an event listener on scroll to the window object and pass a callback function to it. Now this callback function will run each time we scroll on this page. So now inside this callback function we can calculate the difference between the current scroll in the y-axis and the y-axis coordinates of that element. So when the difference is equals to 0, then we can add a visible class to it, and that's all we have to do to implement this functionality. But here this implementation have more issues than girls have with my face. Firstly, it is very inefficient because even if we scroll a little onto the page, this callback function will be called rapidly, causing unnecessary execution of code. And secondly, we have to manually calculate the difference, and that's a lot of math for a front-end developer, and all these problems can make it a pain to implement this functionality. But unlike my face, for which we cannot do much about, here we have an alternate way to implement the same functionality, and that is by using Intersection Observer API. Here first we need to create a new object of Intersection Observer API. This Intersection Observer API takes two parameters while creating. First, the callback function, and second, the configuration object. Now we will call the observe method on this observer that we have just created and put sections which we want it to observe as its parameter. Now in the configuration object which we are passing while creating the observer, we define three properties: root, root margin, and threshold. Root is the element with which if our observed elements comes in contact with, then the callback function will be executed. Now root margin and the threshold are the properties in which most of the people get confused. Like, what is the key difference between them? You can think of root margin as the CSS margin property. It can take both relative and static value. Therefore you can give it a value in pixels or in percentage. This sets an imaginary margin over the root element, by which we can state how much margin earlier we want the callback function to be called before the root element make contact with the observing element. On the other hand, the threshold value can take either one value between 0 and 1 or an array of values between 0 and 1. With this threshold property defined, we can tell our observer at how much intersection between the observing element and the root element the function should be called. Now that we understand how to configure the configuration object, let's talk about the callback function. So here in this callback function we provide two arguments. Number one is the entries and number two is the observer itself. Now we know that intersection observer can take more than one element to be observed, because of which we get an array of entry instead of a singular entry, because multiple elements can be intersecting to the observer at the very same time. So here we can iterate over this entire array of entries and access each entry individually. So here this entry has a property called is intersecting, which gives a true or false value. So if the element is intersecting with the root element, then it will give us a true value, otherwise it will be false. Now to add the animation, we just have to check whether the section is intersecting or not, and if it is intersecting, then add the class, otherwise remove it. Now to get the section to which we need to apply these classes, we just have to access the entry.target property, and this target property will be pointing to the section because of which the entry was created. And that is all we have to do to implement this functionality with the help of Intersection Observer API. Now here this implementation is way more optimized because this code will only be executed when the sections are in the view, otherwise no code will be executed. So that is all about Intersection Observer API. Now if you are new to this channel,
please
so make sure to subscribe the channel and like. Intersection Observer API is a web API which is available in all modern browsers.
खराब कर दिया मेरा टेक, बदतमीज।